Every era of warfare sort of had its meta, the things that defined it, the things that militaries sort of focused around, centered around. First, I would say probably you had like your chariots they were the big deal. They were the new kid on the block. Then you had your really quite a long period of heavy infantry domination, and that was from you could go Babylon, Neo-Assyria till a little after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You have your iconic Roman legionaries, your iconic hoplites, your iconic Sarissa phalanx. Maybe if you're like a little more into it, you got your immortals or some Chinese shit that I don't know about. But after that era, to me it seems very tied to the Western Roman Empire is when the collapse of it is when it started to change, started to shift for many reasons. Meta went away from heavy infantry to heavy cavalry. Seemingly everywhere. Armored person on a horse became either the dominant thing on the battlefield or a major part, a dominant part of a larger combined arms machine, as the nerds would say. What's fascinating, to me at least, is that even though everywhere basically had heavy cavalry at the center of its military theory or practice, what exactly that heavy cavalry was meant to do, the actions it was expected to perform, how it was armed, was different, very different. And this is one of the few things that I think there's like a big east-west difference in. Like, I think this is one of the rare few times where you could say, oh, the western and the eastern. Because I don't really believe in all that shit. But this is one of those times. And I think, and I will prove to you, that these differences, how they used heavy cavalry, the theory and mindset of war behind that, where that came from, can show you much more than you may believe. More than just about warfare or conflict, but about society and how people viewed the individual itself. Maybe, I don't know. I am not a historian.
Not up in here! Denied.
Disclaimer, I am not a historian. These are all just my very well-researched opinions. You do not have to be a historian to be very well-educated on history. You can do that yourself. It takes a little bit of effort and an internet connection, maybe. You could always go to the library if those folks go. These are all my opinions. Anything that says is your own problem. Stay motivated. Read a book. First, I would say probably you had like your chariots they were the big deal. They were the new kid on the block. Then you had your really quite a long period of heavy infantry domination. And that was from, you could go Babylon, Neo-Assyria till a little after probably the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You have your iconic Roman legionaries, your iconic hoplites, your iconic Sarissa phalanx. Maybe if you're like a little more into it, you got your immortals or some Chinese shit that I don't know about. But after that era, to me it seems very tied to the Western Roman Empire. The collapse of it is when things started to change, started to shift. The meta went away from, for many reasons, from heavy infantry to heavy cavalry. And this was seemingly, these are all my opinions, shit. I am not a historian. Everywhere. Armored person on a horse became either the dominant thing on the battlefield or a major part, a dominant part of a larger combined arms machine, as the nerds would say. What's fascinating, though, to me at least, is that even though everywhere basically had heavy cavalry at the center of its military theory or practice, what exactly that heavy cavalry was meant to do, the actions it was expected to perform, how it was armed, was different, very different. And this is one of the few things that I think there's like a big east-west difference in. Like, I think this is one of the rare few times where you could say, oh, the Western and the Eastern. Because I don't really believe in all that shit. I think that's kind of, but this is one of those times. And I think, and I will prove to you, that these differences in how they used heavy cavalry, theory and mindset of war behind that, where that came from, shows you a lot more than just, or at least to me, like I thought I figured something out. How did it come to that? How did it go from your heavy infantry domination to nothing like that? Go ask a fucking historian. But if you want my opinion, which you can't sue me for, I'll give it to you right now. Let's start with the West. Be like Germany, and a little more, but like really Germany and West from that. You think of the European tradition. The West was relatively late to adopt the Cav meta. And we'll take Crassus' famous iconic expedition into the Levant, where the Roman legionaries meet the Parthian horse archers and cataphracts, and they get absolutely f***ed up. Rome, at that time, their cavalry, they had their equites, right? Their merchant class horsemen people, their knights, I guess, which I don't know where that came from, but their guys that they relied on for cavalry usually came from other subject peoples who were more apt at that. But as Rome collapses, the system is no longer able to sustain and train and pay and feed and equip and keep loyal these large, professional, heavily armored forces of infantry. And you now have a continued influx of these Germanic barbarians and more familiar horse people. You kind of have to go with what you got. And what you got is not a lot of people, but you have these Germanic, savage, furious, scary, big Germanic people. And you have these, what remains of the Roman discipline and values and ethics, as some nerd would say. I think what set the West apart and what would affect the whole military theory after that was the focus on decisive pitched battles decided by shock action. And that could be like the Roman legionaries just cutting through your lines. That could be the phalanx just ripping through your guys. Or, like, say you were the Germans and you were fighting some Gauls. There's more Gauls, but you don't have the organization and discipline of Rome. What you do have is bravery and savageness. You aren't scared of You're not scared of a thing. And you have a horse. So their shock action was charge them and they'll break them. Which, if you think about that, how terrifying must that have been? Just at any point in time, for you to be just a guy on foot. If you're lucky, you got some armor. If you're real lucky, you got like a whole bunch of pikes, and you're also holding a pike. To be a guy on foot and have hundreds or thousands of men on horses with pointy sticks screaming their lungs out or whatever coming at you. And there's scientists and they've said that in a bayonet charge, that's another shock action. A bayonet charge, or like the Swiss pikemen, and they're running straight at the enemy, and they're really dense squares. They think, at least in like the Civil War, that bayonet charges, people rarely ever actually used the bayonet, and that the bayonet charges rarely actually ever connected. And people say that. There's a lot of There's a lot of evidence that it did. The fear, it's not even necessarily that you have to kill or maim all of the enemy in front of you or whatever. You just have to get enough of them to start running that the rest of them are going to run. And when they ran, you could slaughter them. The best example of that is probably the Knight. Was it the best that of all militaries ever and of the medieval period? No. But as a pure unit of shock action, a thing meant to deliver a charge, scare and kill people, the Western European, particularly Knight, is the pinnacle. And the Knight in their mindset of the West, it was unique to there and then. Well, not just there and then, but it was unique to the West. It was unique to the Western Roman Empire and the areas that would replace it. Because if you move over to the east a little bit, you'll see Byzantines, the Romans, the Eastern Romans, and their conflicts with the Normans, who were, you know who the Normans are. If you're watching this video, you know who the Normans were. You don't need me to explain it. Read the book. Anna Comini herself, she would said that the charge of the Franks, who were the Normans, because they were from the Frankish Germanic barbarians, like Clovis and the Salian Franks, but doesn't matter. Anna Comini would say that the Normans, that their charge was irresistible. She would say that the charge of the Normans, their lances could shake the very walls of Constantinople. Even Romans, the mighty Roman legions, they feared the Führer Teutonicus, the German Fury. And that was hundreds of years before you get your Knight. And before that, in Charlemagne is really where I think it starts to take off. That's where you really see the birth of the earliest forms of this, of the European Knight, the European heavy cavalry tradition, where it becomes its own distinct thing, and it no longer has its own identity, separate from the Roman equites or blah blah blah. Would be around the time of Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. For that, in the largely Frankish dominated West, you had your largely infantry-centric armies. Even at Tours itself, Charles had his bread and butter was heavy infantry. And the fucking Muslims just rode at him straight again and again and again, and they threw him back, and then Odo hit him in the flank or whatever. I don't know. It's after that, when the Carolingian Empire gets going, that you see Dan Carlin calls it a proto-knight. You see that sort of thing. The heavy cavalry, the decisive arm, the noble horseman with the Cavalry. Dan Carlin said milites, but I'm pretty sure milite was just like a Latin professional soldier. I'm not disagreeing with Dan. You have the Cavallarius, who are unarmored horse, chainmail guy, and you also have the Scara, who are the rapid response troops. And you see where these noble armored horsemen in the Carolingian Empire, the first empire in Europe, in Western Europe, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then that collapses. But the thing that sticks, the thing that you can now build something on, are these noble heavy cavalrymen that are tied to the land. And it was this area in particular that you had, I call it Teutonic fury, Roman discipline, and bravery. Now, it could be just a completely redacted thing to say or point. Maybe it has nothing to do with that, but I kind of think it does. Because when you look at the Knight, you have this big, well-trained, disciplined, more or less disciplined in comparison, heavily armored, reliable unit that it doesn't have to do a whole lot. It doesn't have to worry about forming a whole bunch of formations and different like that. All you really have to have this thing do to achieve your broader goal of shock action that pushes the enemy off the field or kills, scares, wounds, maims as many of the enemy as possible. That's all it has to do. And you already have these, you don't need a lot of them. And they're already there. They're already tied to the land. And you have your knights. Whereas if you move over to the Byzantines, move over to the east, you see, I think it's closer to most of the world and how it believed in, not just using heavy cavalry, but as we said, how that use shows their mindset or the theory of war. Because even though you had whereas in the West, it was sort of later to adopt cavalry as the meta. In the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman world, heavy cavalry became a much bigger player to the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Europe side of it than it did in the West. You had like the most iconic, or like what you think of your Eastern European heavy cavalrymen, or the earliest versions, and specifically for like the Byzantines, you think of your Klibnari, your Cataphract, and while they were just as capable of delivering a charge, doing that shock action of getting in there and mixing it up with the enemy. That wasn't their goal. That wasn't the only thing that they were made to do. And if you look at, like I said earlier about Anna Company, especially in like the 1000s and the 900s, when you have the Normans and other Western Europeans, other Franks, Latins fighting the Byzantines, even though the Cataphract would have been a heavier cavalry than your European knight, your Norman knight in particular, like more armored. There was just something different, something that set the knight apart above the Cataphract. And I'm not gonna try and say that, oh, this is the exact reason, but think about it. In Western Europe, in that part of the old Roman Empire, you didn't have as many enemies that fought in as many different ways, that came from as many different traditions as the Eastern half would have. Because just as all that shit is, flooding into Western Europe, it's also hitting Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and then some. Because you have like your Rus, you have your steppe people that would come in every now and then. You've got, after like 622, just an endless wave of an endless, literally still to this day, unending wave of Muslims. Sometimes they're Arabs, sometimes they're Turks, sometimes they're fucking some other shit. But even though the Eastern European heavy cavalrymen wouldn't one for one match the knight, especially in like doing the shock action, the military of the Byzantine Empire itself was better than that of the Western European style. Because even though the knight was better, a better heavy cavalry, better shock deliverer, that was the best part of the European, especially a Western European army. That was the decider. Whereas to not just the Byzantines, but to most of the rest of the world who were fighting war at a higher level, the heavy cavalry that they employed was an important part, but a part of a machine. And because the Byzantine Empire had to compete with successive machines, they themselves had to become one. And this is not saying anything negative about the Byzantine or like Eastern European military at all. I don't think they're worse, but they're different. Because they weren't meant to be the same thing as the knight. Like the late Byzantine Cataphract, we'll say. What they would do is they would ride forward in like these big diamond formations, like knee to knee. But whereas the knights would ride forward with lances couched, which is in your shoulder or whatever, and they were just gonna smash into the enemy. Didn't matter what it was, like the infantry, cavalry, no one gave a fuck. What they were going to do was the shock action. And I take a fucking drink every time I say that. And the speed and the furiosity and the ability and training of the individual knights who were grouped together, that is what carried them to success. Whereas you take the Byzantines, they would ride forward together, as I said. But there would be, in a lot of these formations, or maybe in all of them, they would have either some or all of them would be armed with a bow, and they would be firing continuously as they're going forward at a much, much slower, deliberate pace. And then when they got close and they closed, the enemy's already weakened. Then they would, at this much slower pace, they'd hit them with like maces and blah, 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 blah. Even as all that was happening, you had, for these Byzantine armies, you could have your infantrymen reliably, somewhat, holding their own. Because a history theory, I think that because of the fact that these, not just the minds, I don't think it was the mindset, or that it was, these have more Germanic heritage and influence and blah, blah, blah. I believe it was because, the reason why, like the Western the Western heavy cavalry men, was so much better than, at least at doing the shock action and being a heavy armor death stick, was better than like Eastern Europe or really anywhere else in the world, was also why European armies, they struggled so much against like the Crusades, or against the Islamic powers in the Crusades, or against like the Ottomans or any other of those, where the Byzantines, yes, they struggled for different reasons, but militarily, just as a theoretical, like from their theory, from their way of war, was better. It was more advanced than that of Western Europe because it had to be.
Not up in here!